Welcome to the London Gritty Chronicles. Today, we are looking at the single greatest shift in labor history. We are looking at how the lowest class of people, those who owned nothing, not even their own time, suddenly found the power to say no. But before we can understand the revolution, we must understand the prison. Imagine a field in England. The year is 1340. It is a summer morning, and the mist is lifting off the grass. You hear the sound of a scythe cutting wheat. Swish, swish, swish. It is a rhythmic, peaceful sound. But for the man holding the tool, there is no peace. There is only duty. This man is a serf. In historical English, a serf is an unfree peasant. He is not a slave, exactly, but he is not free. He is bound to the land. Listen to that phrase, bound to the land. It means he cannot leave. He cannot move to another village. He cannot marry without permission. If the land is sold to a new lord, the serf is sold along with the trees and the stones. For centuries, this was the way of the world. It was a system called feudalism. In this series, we are going to trace the collapse of this system. We will see how a biological disaster, the Black Death, shattered the chains of the past. We will learn how a population cut in half led to wages doubling. We will learn the vocabulary of rights, labor, and social class. But right now, in 1340, the system looks unbreakable. It looks eternal. Let us look closely at this feudal pyramid. This is essential vocabulary for understanding British history. At the very top is the king. Below him are the nobles, the dukes, earls, and barons. They own the land. Below them are the knights and the clergy, the churchmen. And at the very bottom, supporting everyone else, are the peasants. The English used a specific phrase to describe this society: the three estates. The first estate was those who pray, the priests and monks. The second estate was those who fight, the nobles and knights. The third estate was those who work, the peasants. Notice the verb choice: pray, fight, work. There was no those who negotiate. There was no those who improve. You were born into your estate, and you stayed there. This is what we call social immobility. Mobility comes from the word move. If you have social mobility, you can move up in society. You can be born poor and die rich. In 1340 England, social mobility was almost zero. It was a static world. Let's zoom in on the life of our serf in the field. Let's call him John. John is a common name, and John is a common man. He lives in a small village in Suffolk. His house is made of wattle and daub, woven sticks covered in mud and manure. It has one room. He shares this room with his wife, his 4 children, and likely a pig or a cow during the winter to keep warm. John does not own his farm. He holds it by the will of the Lord. In exchange for living there, he must work for the Lord for free, usually 3 days a week. This labor is called corvée, or simply week work. Imagine that. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. You work for someone else for 0 pay. You harvest his crops, you fix his fences, you clean his ditches. Only on Thursday can you work on your own small plot of land to feed your family. But the restrictions went deeper than just work. Let's look at two legal terms that terrified the peasantry: merchant and harriet. Merchant was a fine you paid to the lord if your daughter wanted to get married. Think about the implication of that. You do not own your family's future. The Lord does. Harriet was the death tax. When a serf died, the lord had the right to take the family's best animal. Imagine John dies. His widow is grieving. She has lost her husband and the main worker. And then the lord's bailiff arrives and takes her best cow. This was Harriet. It kept the poor, poor. It prevented the accumulation of wealth. This system relied on one crucial factor: labor surplus. Here is a phrase to remember: labor surplus. This means there are too many workers and not enough jobs. When there is a surplus of workers, labor is cheap. If John complains, the Lord can kick him out and replace him instantly. There are 10 other men waiting for John's spot. Because the population was high, human life was cheap. The individual had no leverage. Leverage is a great word. Physically, a lever helps you lift a heavy object. In business and negotiation, leverage is the power or advantage you have over the other side. In 1340, the peasants had zero leverage. The lords held all the cards. The English language reflects this power dynamic. The words for meat on the table come from the French spoken by the nobles. Beef, pork, mutton, poultry. The words for the animals in the muddy field come from the Germanic Old English spoken by the peasants. Cow, pig, sheep, chicken. The peasant raises the pig. The noble eats the pork. The language itself was divided by class, so the structure was rigid. The hierarchy was absolute. The church told the peasants that this was God's will. To rebel against the Lord was to rebel against the natural order of the universe. But nature has a way of changing the order of the universe. While John is harvesting wheat in Suffolk, something is happening thousands of miles away. It is happening on the steppes of Central Asia. It is happening in the bustling ports of the Crimea. A bacteria is waking up. The bacteria is called Yersinia pestis. It lives in the gut of a flea. The flea lives on the back of a black rat. The rat likes to travel. We often think of history as being made by kings and generals. We think of battles and treaties. But the biggest history is often made by the smallest things. In 1347, the Genoese trading ships fled the port of Kaffa in the Black Sea. They were escaping a siege, but they brought an invisible passenger with them. They sailed through Constantinople, through the Mediterranean, to Sicily, and then to Italy. Everywhere they docked, the town died. Reports began to reach England. Merchants whispered stories in the taverns of London. They spoke of a great pestilence in Florence and Paris. They said that in some cities there were not enough living to bury the dead. But in the English countryside, the harvest continued. The lords counted their coin. The bailiffs collected their fines. They felt safe. England was an island, protected by the sea. The Channel was a moat. Surely the horror would stop at the water's edge. They were wrong. We arrive now at the moment everything changes. The date is June 1348. The place is a port town called Melcombe Regis. known today as Weymouth, on the southern coast of England. It is a grey, humid day. A ship from Gascony, a region in France, glides into the harbor. The sailors throw the ropes to the dock workers. The wood creaks. It looks like a normal delivery of wine, but notice the details. Perhaps a sailor stumbles as he walks down the gangplank. He is sweating, even though the wind is cool. He has a painful swelling in his groin, the size of an apple. He coughs, spitting blood onto the wooden planks of the pier. Behind him, unseen in the shadows of the cargo hold, a black rat scurries down a rope and onto English soil. This is the accidental twist. No one declared war, no army landed, just a sick sailor and a rat. But this arrival would kill more people than any war in British history. In English, we often use the word vector to describe how a disease travels. The rat was the host, the flea was the vector, but the ship was the delivery system. The people of Melcombe Regis did not know it, but the clock had started ticking. The incubation period, the time between catching the disease and showing symptoms, is a few days. For a few days, the town seemed normal. The sailors drank in the pubs, the rats bred in the granaries. Then, the screaming started. This was the beginning of the Great Mortality. Later, the Victorians would call it the Black Death. But at the time, they just called it the pestilence. Why is this important for our story of the peasant class? Because the feudal system, which we described earlier, depended on stability. It depended on having plenty of people like John, the serf. It depended on John being afraid, replaceable, and stuck. The bacteria does not care about your title. It does not care if you are a lord or a serf. It kills indiscriminately. And when you kill a significant percentage of the workforce, the rules of economics change instantly. If John dies, that is a tragedy. But if John and his 3 neighbors die, who harvests the wheat? Who bakes the bread? Suddenly, the survivor, the one man left standing, is not so replaceable anymore. We will watch the horror unfold. We will see the biology of the plague tear through the social fabric of England. We will learn the vocabulary of epidemics and collapse. The ship has docked. The rat is ashore. The silence of the summer morning is about to be broken by the tolling of funeral bells. The summer of 1348 turned into a wet, miserable autumn. The rain did not wash away the sickness. It seemed to feed it. From the port of Melcombe Regis, the disease moved inland. It traveled along the roads, hidden in the carts of merchants and the saddlebags of travelers. It moved fast. By November, it had reached London. By the new year, it covered the whole country. Let us look at the biology of the nightmare. This is the biology to society mirror. Just as the human body was being attacked from the inside, the body of society was breaking down. The medical term for this specific disease is bubonic plague. It gets its name from the bubo. A bubo is a swollen, painful lymph node. Usually it appears in the armpit, the neck, or the groin. Imagine our serf, John. He wakes up shivering. He thinks it is just a cold, but then he feels a hard lump under his arm. It burns. Within 24 hours, the lump turns black. This is where the name Black Death comes from, the necrosis. or dying flesh under the skin. John begins to vomit blood. His fever spikes. He becomes delirious. In historical English, to be delirious means to be confused, seeing things that are not there, often due to high fever. John shouts at ghosts. And then, the silence. Most victims died within 3 to 5 days of the first symptom. But the horror was not just the death. It was the transmission. Transmission is the act of passing something from one person to another. Today, we know about germs. We know about bacteria. In 1348, they knew nothing of this. They believed the disease came from miasma. Miasma is an old word meaning bad air or poisonous mist. People thought the air itself was rotting. To protect themselves, they held posies of flowers or sweet-smelling herbs to their noses. They thought a good smell would block the bad air. It did not work. The disease was highly contagious. In English, if a disease is contagious, it spreads easily between people by contact. The plague was so contagious that a doctor could catch it just by taking a patient's pulse. A priest could catch it by hearing a dying man's confession. This created a terrifying social breakdown. Usually, when someone is sick, the community comes together. Family gathers. Neighbors bring soup. The priest gives a blessing. The Black Death destroyed this compassion. It turned humans into islands. Fathers abandoned their sick children. Wives fled from their dying husbands. The fear was stronger than love. The Italian writer Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague, wrote that brother abandoned brother. In London, the situation was apocalyptic. London in 1348 was a maze of narrow, muddy streets. It was crowded and dirty. Waste was thrown into the street gutters. It was a paradise for rats. The death toll in the cities was staggering. We use the term mortality rate to measure this. The mortality rate is the percentage of a population that dies. In some English villages, the mortality rate was 30%. In others, it was 50%. In some tragic cases, it was 100%. Entire villages were wiped off the map. We call these deserted medieval villages. You can still find their outlines in the English countryside today. Grassy bumps in a field where houses once stood. Let's pause and think about the numbers. It is hard to visualize millions. Imagine a room with 10 people. These are your friends, your family, your coworkers. Now, imagine a stranger walks in and points to 5 of them. You, and you. You will be dead by Tuesday. That was the reality of 1349. The authorities tried to regain control, but they were helpless. The king, Edward III, did not die, but his daughter, Princess Joan, did. She died in Bordeaux on her way to get married. This shocked the nation. If the plague could kill a princess, then truly no one was safe. The hierarchy, the 3 estates we discussed in Part 1, began to tremble. The church, the first estate, suffered heavily. Priests were the frontline workers. They had to visit the sick to give the last rites. Final prayers before death. Because they were exposed, they died in huge numbers. This had a strange effect on the survivors. The peasants saw that the holy men were dying just like the sinners. The psychological armor of the church was cracked. If the priest cannot save himself, How can he save me? By 1350, the first great wave of the pestilence began to fade. The graves were filled. The screaming stopped. The survivors walked out of their cottages. They blinked in the sunlight. They looked around. The world was quiet. The fields were overgrown with weeds. The cows were wandering loose because there was no one to milk them. The crops were rotting in the ground because there was no one to harvest them. But John, our generic peasant, is still alive. He has lost his wife. He has lost 2 of his children. He is heartbroken. He is traumatized. But he notices something else. He walks to the Lord's manor. Usually the fields are full of men working for free. Today the field is empty. The Lord of the manor is desperate. He needs his wheat harvested immediately, or he will lose his wealth. He sees John. "John," the Lord shouts, "get to work. The harvest is late." In 1340, John would have lowered his head and worked. He would have feared the whip. He would have feared eviction. But this is 1350. John looks around. There is no one else. If John doesn't work, the Lord gets nothing. John looks at the Lord. For the first time in his life, he does not lower his eyes. "I am tired, my Lord," John says, "and my back aches. If you want me to harvest that wheat, you will have to pay me." The Lord is shocked. Pay a serf? For work that is meant to be a duty? It is unheard of. It is illegal. It is against the will of God. "I will put you in the stocks," the Lord threatens. John shrugs. "Put me in the stocks then, but the wheat will rot while I sit there, and you have no one else." This is the moment the lever shifts. The labor surplus has become a labor shortage. A shortage is when there is not enough of something. When labor is short, the price of labor goes up. This is the basic law of supply and demand. The supply of workers had crashed. The demand for work remained high. Therefore, the value of the worker skyrocketed. The Black Death was a tragedy of unimaginable scale. But for the survivors at the bottom of the pile, it was the golden key. The chains of feudalism were not broken by a sword. They were dissolved by a germ. But the lords would not give up their power easily. They would fight back. They would use the law to try and force wages back down. They would try to freeze time. We will see the empire strike back. We will learn about the Statute of Laborers, a law designed to crush this new peasant power. We will see the tension rise until it explodes into violence. The plague is over. The class war is just beginning. The year is 1351. The Black Death has retreated, leaving a silence across the land. But in the Palace of Westminster, the silence was replaced by the sound of angry voices. The nobles of England were furious. They had survived the plague, but they were facing a new disaster. It was not a disease of the body. It was a disease of the wallet. They called it the malice of servants. In historical English, malice means the desire to harm someone. The lords believed that the peasants were being evil on purpose. They believed the plowmen and the shepherds were taking advantage of the situation to destroy the natural order. Let's return to John, our peasant survivor. Before the plague, he ate pottage, a thick grain-based soup. He wore rough wool. He never saw a silver coin. Now, in 1351, John is different. He is working for a new master who offered him double his old wages. John has coin in his pocket. On Sundays, he buys fresh meat. He buys a tunic made of brighter, softer cloth. He walks with his head high. To us, this sounds like progress. To the medieval elite, this looked like the end of the world. They felt that if the poor became rich, society would collapse. They believed that God ordained the poor to suffer. So, the empire struck back. King Edward III and his parliament gathered to pass one of the most famous laws in labor history, the Statute of Laborers. Listen to that word, statute. A statute is a formal, written law passed by a legislative body. Before this, many laws were just customs or traditions, but this was written down. It was official. It was a weapon. The Statute of Laborers had a clear goal: to turn back the clock. It tried to make 1351 look exactly like 1346. Here were the main rules of this new law. First, it set a maximum wage. Today we talk about a minimum wage, the lowest amount you can pay someone. The Statute of Laborers invented the opposite. It became illegal to pay a peasant more than he earned before the plague. Second, it made idleness a crime. If you were under the age of 60 and you did not have a job, you could be forced to work for anyone who asked. You could not say no. Third, it restricted mobility. It was illegal to leave your village to find better pay elsewhere. The king's message was clear. The plague changed the population, but it will not change the power. But there was a problem. You can pass a law against theft. You can pass a law against murder. But it is very hard to pass a law against supply and demand. This is where the biology to society mirror becomes fascinating. The plague had biologically removed half the workers. The law tried to pretend they were still there. The reality on the ground was chaotic. Let's look at the strange incident of the harvest. A lord in Norfolk needs his wheat cut. He offers the legal wage, 2 pence a day. The peasants laugh at him. They say, "The lord down the road is offering 4 pence and lunch." The lord has a choice. He can follow the law, pay 2 pence, and watch his wheat rot in the field. Or he can break the law, pay 4 pence, and save his crop. What do you think he did? He broke the law, but he did it quietly. This created a massive black market for labor. In English, a black market is an illegal trade in goods or services. Usually we think of drugs or weapons. In 1351, the illicit contraband was hard work. Lords would pay peasants under the table. This is a great idiom. If you pay someone under the table, you pay them secretly. Often in cash to avoid taxes, or, in this case, to avoid the king's spies. So, on the surface, the feudal system looked restored. The records showed low wages, but in reality, the peasants were winning. However, the psychological gap was widening. The peasants felt a new sense of worth. Self-worth is the internal feeling that you are valuable. Before the plague, a serf's worth was 0. Now, they realized the country could not function without them. They began to see the lords not as protectors, but as parasites. The lords, in turn, became paranoid. They saw the peasants' new clothes and full bellies as an insult. They passed sumptuary laws. Sumptuary laws are laws that regulate consumption. They dictate what you can wear and what you can eat based on your social class. Why? Because if a peasant dresses like a lord, how do you tell the difference? The visual language of power was breaking down. The tension was building like steam in a pressure cooker. The lords were using fines, stocks, and branding irons to enforce the old rules. The peasants were using their new economic leverage to resist. For 30 years, this uneasy peace continued. The workers got richer, and the lords got angrier. The government kept trying to tighten the screws. Then, a new generation of leaders arrived. A young, arrogant king named Richard II came to the throne. And his advisors decided that the best way to control the peasants was not just to limit their wages, but to tax them into submission. In the next part, we will fast forward to 1381. The pressure cooker is about to explode. We will introduce a new character, a man who would become the voice of the revolution. We will learn the vocabulary of poll taxes and rebellion. The Statute of Laborers tried to freeze history, but history is fire. It does not freeze. The year is 1381. It has been 30 years since the Black Death first arrived. The children who survived the plague are now adults. They are a harder, tougher generation. They have known high wages. They have eaten meat. They do not remember the old fear. But the government made a fatal mistake. They forgot that the people had changed. The king's advisors needed money. The war with France, the 100 Years' War, was going badly and it was expensive. They needed cash, fast. So they invented a new tax. It was called the poll tax. This is a crucial term in political English. The word poll is an old word for head. So a poll tax is a head tax. It means every single adult has to pay the same amount, regardless of how rich or poor they are. In modern economics, we call this a regressive tax. A regressive system hurts the poor more than the rich. If the tax is 1 shilling, for a duke 1 shilling is nothing. He drops it and doesn't even look down. But for a peasant, 1 shilling might be a week's wages. It might be the difference between eating and starving. The government demanded this tax not once, but 3 times in 4 years. The third time, in 1381, they demanded a huge sum, 12 pence per person. This was the spark that lit the fuse. The explosion happened in a small village in Essex called Brentwood. On May 30th, 1381, a royal tax collector named John Bampton arrived. He rode in with his soldiers, arrogant and demanding. He opened his books. He demanded to know why the villagers hadn't paid. The villagers gathered in the square. They looked at Bampton. They looked at each other. One man, representing the village, stepped forward. He told Bampton that they had already paid their taxes and they would not pay a penny more. Bampton was furious. He ordered his sergeants to arrest the man. But the sergeants did not move. They couldn't. They were surrounded. The villagers had drawn their weapons, old rusty swords, longbows, and farming scythes. They chased Bampton out of town. They stoned his men. This was not a riot. This was an insurrection. An insurrection is a violent uprising against an authority or government. It is more organized than a riot. News of the defiance in Essex spread like wildfire. It crossed the river into Kent. Village after village rose up. They burned the tax rolls. They attacked the manor houses. They didn't just want to steal, they wanted to destroy the paperwork. Why the paperwork? Because the manorial rolls were the records that proved who was a serf. If you burn the rolls, you erase the record of your slavery. It was a very modern idea. Erase the data, erase the debt. A leader emerged from the chaos. His name was Wat Tyler. We don't know much about Wat Tyler before 1381. His name suggests his trade. A tiler is someone who makes roof tiles. He was charismatic. He was decisive. He became the general of the peasant army. But every army needs a philosophy. They needed a voice to explain why they were fighting. That voice belonged to a priest named John Ball. John Ball was a radical. The church had thrown him in prison for his dangerous ideas. Wat Tyler's men broke into the prison and set him free. John Ball stood before the crowd of thousands and preached a sermon that shook England. He asked a simple, rhyming question that is still famous today. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Let's translate that into modern English. To delve means to dig, like Adam gardening in Eden. To spin, span, means to make thread, like Eve making clothes. Ball was saying, in the Bible, at the beginning of the world, everyone worked. There were no lords. There were no knights. There were no gentlemen. Class distinctions were invented by men, not by God. Therefore, the peasants argued, they were fighting for God's true will. They were egalitarians. Egalitarianism is the belief that all people are equal and deserve equal rights. This idea was terrified the nobility. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the structure of reality. The peasants were claiming they were equal to the king. By June, the peasant army was on the move. They were not a disorganized mob. They marched in columns. They had discipline. And their target was the capital. They were marching to London. Imagine the scene on the walls of London. The mayor looks out and sees the horizon filled with smoke. The great mansions of the king's advisers are burning in the suburbs. Tens of thousands of angry, armed workers are approaching the gates. Inside the Tower of London, the young King Richard II, only 14 years old, huddled with his terrified ministers. They had the crown, the gold, and the power. But they were outnumbered. The three estates were about to collide. The peasants had a specific hit list. They wanted the heads of the men responsible for the poll tax. They wanted the treasurer. They wanted the archbishop. They wanted justice. The peasants will breach the walls of London. We will walk the burning streets. We will witness the most dangerous moment in the history of the English monarchy. We will learn the vocabulary of negotiation and betrayal. The army of the poor is at the gate, and the gate is opening. The gates of London were strong. They had stopped foreign armies before. But on June 13th, 1381, they did not stop the peasants. Why? Because the bridge was lowered from the inside. The ordinary people of London, the shopkeepers, the apprentices, the servants, sympathized with the rebels. They hated the poll tax too. They saw the peasant army not as invaders, but as liberators. The drawbridge of London Bridge creaked down. The mob poured across the Thames like a flood tide. This was the accidental twist for the king's advisors. They thought the city walls were a barrier. Instead, the city itself was part of the infection. The biology to society mirror is clear here. The rebellion wasn't just an external attack. It was an autoimmune reaction. The body of the nation was attacking itself. The peasants moved with terrifying purpose. They did not just run wild. They had targets. Their main target was the Savoy Palace. The Savoy was the most luxurious home in England. It belonged to John of Gaunt, the king's uncle and the most hated man in the realm. He was the architect of the poll tax. The peasants broke down the doors. They smashed the furniture. They tore down the tapestries. They found heaps of gold and silver plate. Now, listen closely to what happened next. This tells us everything about their mindset. If this were a criminal riot, they would have filled their pockets and run. But they did not take a single coin. One man was caught trying to steal a silver cup. The other peasants tied the cup around his neck and threw him into the river.
"We are zealots for truth and justice," they shouted, "not thieves and robbers."
They took the gold and pounded it into dust. They threw the jewels into the Thames. They burned the palace to the ground. This was political theatre. They were showing the king that money had no power over them. They were destroying the symbols of inequality. The king, Richard II, watched the smoke rise from the safety of the Tower of London. He was trapped. He realized he had only one card left to play: diplomacy. Diplomacy is the art of managing international relations, or, in this case, managing a crisis through talk rather than force. The next day, the 14-year-old king rode out to meet the rebels at a place called Mile End. It was a brave move. He was unarmed. He faced Wat Tyler and thousands of armed men. Tyler demanded the impossible. 1. The end of serfdom. 2. The right to buy and sell goods freely. Free trade. 3. A set rent for land, 4 pence an acre. 4. A general amnesty. Amnesty comes from the Greek word for forgetting. It is an official pardon for people who have been convicted of political offenses. Tyler wanted a promise that no one would be punished for the revolt. Amazingly, the king said yes. He agreed to everything. He ordered his clerks to write up charters of freedom right there on the field. A charter is a formal document granting rights. To the peasants, this piece of parchment was holy. It was the proof that they were free. They grabbed the charters, and many went home, weeping with joy. They thought they had won. But Wat Tyler stayed. He was suspicious. He wanted more. He sensed that the king was agreeing too easily. And while the king was negotiating at Mile End, a separate group of rebels broke into the Tower of London. They found the Archbishop of Canterbury, the man who had taxed them. They dragged him to Tower Hill and beheaded him. The violence had crossed a line. They had killed the second most powerful man in the church. The next day, June 15th, the king requested another meeting, this time at Smithfield. Smithfield was the cattle market of London. It was a place of mud, smells, and rough trade. The king waited on his horse. His nobles were tense, their hands near their swords. Wat Tyler rode out alone to meet the king. Tyler was confident, perhaps too confident. He behaved disrespectfully. Accounts say he shook the king's hand aggressively. He called for a flagon of water, rinsed his mouth, and spat it out in front of the monarch. He demanded that all church lands be confiscated and given to the people. This was the moment of maximum tension. The world held its breath. The mayor of London, William Walworth, could not take the insults anymore. He shouted at Tyler. Tyler reached for his dagger. Then, chaos. Walworth drew his sword and slashed Tyler across the neck. Tyler fell from his horse.
"They have killed our captain!"
they screamed.
"Slay them all!"
Thousands of bows were raised. The arrows were nocked. The king and his nobles were seconds away from being massacred. Then, the boy king did something incredible. He did not run away. He rode toward the angry mob. He rode right up to the arrow tips. He raised his hand and shouted, "Sirs, will you shoot your king? I will be your captain. Follow me." The peasants were confused. The king was offering to lead them. Their ingrained respect for the monarchy kicked in. They lowered their bows. They followed him away from the city, into the open fields of Clerkenwell. It was a masterstroke of psychology, but it was also a trap. While the king led them away, the mayor rode back into the city to gather reinforcements. The Chart of Freedom was about to become a death warrant. We will see the aftermath of Smithfield. We will learn the meaning of retribution. We will see what happens when the promises of a king collide with the reality of power. The leader is dead. The army is confused. The hammer is about to fall. The fields of Clerkenwell were silent. The peasants waited for the king's command. They thought he was their new captain. They thought the revolution had succeeded. Then, the sound of hoofbeats. Not the king's men, but the mayor's men. Mayor Walworth arrived with a hastily assembled militia. These were the rich merchants of London, clad in armor, weapons drawn. They surrounded the confused peasant army. The mood shifted instantly. The king, who had just been their captain, turned his horse around. The mask fell off. The peasants fell to their knees. They begged for mercy. They held up their charters, the papers that promised them freedom. They thought these papers would save them. King Richard II looked down at them. He was no longer the brave boy. He was the vengeful monarch. He spoke words that would haunt the working class for centuries. "Serfs you were, and serfs you are. You shall remain in bondage, not as before, but incomparably worse." This is the betrayal. The king declared the charters null and void. In legal English, if a contract is null and void, it has no validity. It is as if it never existed. The soldiers moved in. But notice this detail. They did not massacre everyone. They could have killed thousands right there in the field, but they didn't. Why? Because of the economic reality. If you kill all your workers, who is going to harvest the crops next month? The lords were angry, but they were not stupid. They needed these men alive. However, they needed the leaders dead. This brings us to the word retribution. Retribution is punishment inflicted on someone as vengeance for a wrong or criminal act. It is not just punishment, it is payback. The retribution was swift. Wat Tyler was already dead, his head displayed on a spike on London Bridge. John Ball, the priest who preached equality, was captured. He was tried and executed in the gruesome manner of the time. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. The message was clear. Do not challenge the system. The government sent judges into the countryside to hunt down the rebels. Gibbets, gallows, were built in the village squares. For a few months, terror ruled England. So, was the Peasants' Revolt a failure? In the short term, yes. The rebellion was crushed, the leaders were killed, the taxes remained, the laws of serfdom were reaffirmed. But if we look closer, we see a paradox. A paradox is a situation that seems contradictory, but is actually true. The paradox is this: the peasants lost the war, but they won the peace. How is that possible? Think back to the biology of the plague. The population was still low, the labor shortage was still real. The king could burn all the charters he wanted, but he could not print more people. The lords returned to their manners. They looked at their angry, sullen workers. They held the whip in one hand and the Statute of Laborers in the other. But the workers simply drifted away. They used a tactic we might call passive resistance. They worked slowly. They broke tools by accident. Or, in the dead of night, they simply packed their bags and walked to the next town. In the past, the Lord would have chased them. But now? The Lord in the next town was desperate for workers. He didn't care if the man was a runaway serf. He just needed someone to plow the field. So, the neighboring lord would hire the runaway, pay him a high wage, and ask no questions. The legal chains were still there, but the economic lock was broken. Gradually, a new type of contract emerged. It was called copyhold. Instead of being a serf with no rights, the peasant was given a copy of the court roll recording his landholding. He had a document. He had rights. He paid rent instead of labor. He was no longer a serf. He was a tenant. The difference between these two words is the difference between property and a customer. A serf is property. A tenant is a customer. By the year 1400, serfdom in England was effectively dead. It wasn't killed by a sword at Smithfield. It was killed by the invisible hand of the market. It withered away like an old leaf. This transition created a new class of people. They were not nobles, but they were not poor. They were the yeomanry. A yeoman, listen for this word in period dramas, is a man who owns and cultivates his own small estate. He is free. He has a voice. This new class began to change the culture of England. They sent their sons to school. They learned to read. And importantly, they began to speak a new kind of English. We will look at how this social revolution changed the English language itself. We will see how English moved from the language of the muddy field to the language of the law court. We will trace the rise of the middle class. The revolt failed. The revolution succeeded. We have seen the battles and the betrayals. Now, let's look at the words. Language is not just a way to speak. It is a fossil record of history. The shift from serf to yeoman didn't just change the economy, it changed the English language forever. Before the Black Death, English was a third-class language. 1. Latin was the language of the church and the god. 2. French was the language of the court, the law, and the king. 3. English was the language of the unwashed masses. If you wanted to sue someone, you did it in French. If you wanted to pray, you did it in Latin. If you wanted to tell a joke about a pig, you used English. But the rise of the peasant class changed the prestige of their tongue. As the yeomen became wealthier, they needed to understand the law. They were buying land. They were signing contracts. They couldn't afford to rely on French-speaking lawyers who might cheat them. They demanded to do business in their own language. In 1362, just after the second wave of the plague, Parliament passed the Statute of Pleading. This is a massive milestone. This law stated that all court proceedings could be conducted in English. Why? The statute admits it. Because the French tongue is much unknown in the said realm. The plague had killed so many French teachers and noblemen that the upper class was forgetting their own language. The biology of the disease forced the aristocracy to speak the language of the survivor. This era gave us the Great Vowel Shift and the birth of Middle English. Let's look at some vocabulary that emerged or shifted meaning during this time of class struggle. Freeman. Originally, this just meant not a slave, but as the yeoman class grew, it came to mean someone who had political rights, who could vote in local elections, who owned himself. Contract, from the Latin contractus, drawn together. The move from status, you are born a serf, to contract, we agree on a wage, is the fundamental shift of the modern world. And consider the word commoner. In the early days, common meant low, vulgar, cheap. But the House of Commons, part of Parliament, began to gain real power. Being a commoner started to carry a weight of dignity. It meant you were part of the community, the commons. This is the signature differentiator of English society compared to France or Russia. In those countries, the divide between noble and peasant remained rigid for centuries more. In England, the lines blurred. Why? Because the yeomen were rich enough to buy the armor of a knight. In the 1400s, the English army was famous for its longbowmen. These were not knights, they were peasants. They were John the Serf's grandsons. A longbow takes a lifetime of training to master. You need strong shoulders and good food. A starving serf cannot draw a longbow. A well-fed yeoman can. This military reality forced the kings to respect the lower classes. You cannot treat men like animals if you need them to win your wars. So, the English language became a hybrid. It took the fancy French words of the government and mixed them with the sturdy Germanic words of the people. We see this mix in our legal pairs today. Breaking and entering. Breaking equals English. Entering equals French origin. Will and testament. Will equals English. Testament equals Latin/French. Assault and battery. This repetition was necessary because, for a while, people were speaking two different dialects of power. To be understood by everyone, you had to say it twice. This is a great lesson for learners. English is a sponge. It absorbs words from the people it conquers, and also from the people who conquer it. But the most profound change was in the stories people told. Before this time, literature was about knights fighting dragons, romance. After this time, we get the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer wrote in English, not Latin. And look at his characters. He has a knight, yes, but he also has a miller, a reeve, a cook, a wife of Bath. He gives the third estate a voice. He describes the miller as a rough, strong man who can break a door with his head. He describes the reeve, a manager of a manor, as a cunning man who is smarter than his lord. These are the new men of England. They are not victims. They are complicated, funny, greedy, and powerful. Chaucer's decision to write in English was a revolutionary act. It validated the language of the street. It said, "This language is good enough for art." So, by the early 1400s, the stage was set. The serf was gone. The tenant farmer had arrived. The language had unified. But the story isn't over. The memory of 1381, of Wat Tyler and John Ball, went underground. It became a folk memory, a sleeping giant. Whenever the rich pushed too hard, the poor would remember, "We did it once. We can do it again." We will jump forward to see how this legacy influenced the Industrial Revolution and the modern concept of workers' rights. We will see how the Black Death ultimately led to the Union. We will learn the vocabulary of collective bargaining and strike. The germ killed the body, but it cured the paralysis of the class system. We have traveled from the muddy fields of 1348 to the courtroom of 1400. Now, let's bridge the gap to the modern world. The ghost of Wat Tyler did not disappear. It waited. The transition from serfdom to free labor created the foundation for everything we recognize as modern capitalism. Let's define a key term: social mobility. We mentioned this in Part 1. In 1340, it was a flat line. By 1500, it was a ladder. It was a slippery, dangerous ladder, but you could climb it. A yeoman could become a merchant. A merchant could buy land and become a gentleman. His son could go to university and become a lawyer. His grandson could be a knight. This movement is unique. In many other cultures, your caste was your destiny. In England, money began to talk louder than blood. But money is a cruel master. As the feudal protections vanished, so did the feudal safety net. A serf could not be fired. A free laborer could be fired instantly. This new insecurity led to the enclosure movement. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the lords realized that sheep were more profitable than peasants. Wool was white gold. So they started to fence off, enclose, the common lands. The village green, the shared woods, places where the poor grazed their cows for free, was suddenly locked up. This was a second trauma, almost as big as the plague. The peasants were pushed off the land. Where did they go? They went to the cities. They went to London, Manchester, Birmingham. They became the fuel for the Industrial Revolution. Here is the historical rhyme. In 1348, a biological shock, plague, created a labor shortage, raising wages. In 1750, a technological shock, machines, created a labor surplus, lowering wages. The factory owners of the 19th century treated their workers much like the lords treated the serfs. Long hours, dangerous conditions, low pay. But the workers remembered something. They remembered that they had agency. Agency is the capacity of individuals to act independently and make their own free choices. They began to organize. They formed guilds, which evolved into trade unions. A union is a group of workers who join together to protect their rights. Listen to the vocabulary of the union movement. It echoes the Peasants Revolt. Strike, when workers refuse to work until their demands are met. This is exactly what the peasants did in the harvest of 1349. They downed tools. Collective bargaining, negotiating as a group. One worker is weak, like John the serf. All workers together are strong, like the army at Smithfield. Scab, a worker who breaks the strike and works for the boss. In 1351, this would have been the man who accepted the lower legal wage. The fight for the 8-hour day, for the weekend, for sick pay, all of these trace their DNA back to the breakdown of feudalism. Let's look at a linguistic connection. The word villain. Today, a villain is a bad guy in a movie. The Joker is a villain. But originally, the word was villain. A villain was just another legal word for a serf, a villager. Why did farm worker become bad guy? Because the stories were written by the upper class. To the lords, the villeins were the ones rioting, demanding higher wages, and being malicious. So, over centuries, the word for peasant morphed into the word for criminal. This is a semantic shift. It shows how class prejudice is built into English itself. But there is another word, rights. In the Magna Carta, 1215, rights belonged to the barons. In the Petition of Right, 1628, rights belonged to the Parliament. By the 19th century, we talk about human rights. This concept, that you have rights simply because you are a human being, not because of your rank, is the ultimate victory of the peasant class. It took 500 years to get from the Statute of Laborers to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But the line is continuous. The Black Death taught a brutal lesson. The king bleeds like the serf. The bishop rots like the baker. In the face of death, we are equal. Therefore, in life, we should be equal too. This idea is the engine of Western democracy. It wasn't invented by philosophers in Greek togas. It was forged in the mud by terrified survivors who looked at their empty villages and realized, I am still here. I matter. In the next part, we will recap the entire journey. We will review the key English vocabulary we have learned. We will look at before versus after snapshots to solidify your understanding. We are nearing the end of our chronicle. Let us pause for a moment. We have covered nearly 100 years of history. We have watched a society collapse and rebuild itself. To truly understand this story, and to improve your English, we need to look at the before and the after side by side. We need to measure the distance traveled. In English, when we compare two different times or situations, we use specific contrast connectors. Listen for words like whereas, conversely, and in contrast. These are powerful tools for your own speaking and writing. Let's look at status. In 1340, before the plague, our peasant John was a serf. He was property. He was bound to the land. If he ran away, he was hunted like an animal. In contrast, by 1400, John's grandson was a tenant or a yeoman. He was a customer. He paid rent. If he didn't like the landlord, he could pack his card and leave. The chains had become contracts. Let's look at wages. In 1340, there was a labor surplus. Because there were too many people, labor had no value. John worked for free, corvée, just to exist. Conversely, after the pestilence, there was a labor shortage. The value of a man's time skyrocketed. The lords tried to stop this with the Statute of Laborers, but the market was stronger than the law. Let's look at language. In 1340, the language of power was French. If you spoke English in court, you were laughed at. English was for the barn, not the bench. However, by 1400, the Statute of Pleading had passed. Chaucer was writing poetry in English. The language of the commoner had conquered the castle. This transition is what historians call a paradigm shift. A paradigm is a standard way of thinking or a model of reality. A shift is a change. So, the entire model of how the world worked had changed. Let's review the key vocabulary that allowed this shift to happen. These are the words you should take away from this documentary. 1. Feudalism, the rigid pyramid system. King, greater than noble, greater than peasant. It relies on everyone staying in their place. 2. Mortality, the death rate. The Black Death created a mortality rate so high that it broke the pyramid. 3. Leverage, the power to negotiate. The plague gave the poor leverage for the first time. 4. Insurrection, the violent uprising. The Peasants Revolt of 1381 was a failed military insurrection, but a successful psychological one. 5. Emancipation, the process of being set free. The serfs were not emancipated by a benevolent king. They were emancipated by economic necessity. Why does this matter to you as an English learner? Because the English you speak today is the product of this struggle. When you say, "I want a raise," you are using the logic of the post-plague economy. When you say, "That's not fair," you are echoing the sermon of John Bull. When you sign a contract for a job, you are exercising the rights that the villains fought for. History is not just dates. It is the story of how we got here. The London Gritty Chronicles is about seeing the dirt under the fingernails of history. We don't just look at the crown, we look at the boots. We have one final part remaining. We will conclude our journey. I will give you a final summary of the themes. We will look at the resilience of the human spirit. And I will give you a final English challenge: how to use these historical concepts to describe the modern world. The serf is dead. The citizen is alive. We stand at the end of the road. We have walked through the valley of the shadow of death. We have seen the fires of London. We have heard the silence of the empty villages. What is the final lesson of this chronicle? It is a lesson about transformation. In English, we have a powerful idiom, a blessing in disguise. This means something that seems terrible at first, but actually results in something good. The Black Death was the most terrible event in human history. It killed millions. It caused unimaginable sorrow. And yet, for the survivors, it was a blessing in disguise. It broke the prison of feudalism. It forced the wealthy to treat the poor with a shred of respect. It proves that history is not a straight line. It is a spiral. Disaster leads to change. Change leads to conflict. Conflict leads to progress. Think of our friend John, the serf we met in part 1. He never learned to read. He never traveled further than 10 miles from his home. He died young. But because he survived the plague, his children demanded higher wages. His grandchildren learned a trade. His great-grandchildren fought for the right to vote. And eventually, his descendants, people like you and me, gained the freedom to choose our own destiny. We are the heirs of that struggle. When you learn English, you are not just learning grammar and vocabulary. You are learning the code of a civilization that rebuilt itself from the ashes. Every time you use the word freedom, remember the serfs who didn't have it. Every time you use the word negotiate, remember the peasants at Mile End who tried to talk to a king. Every time you use the word salary, payment for work, remember the labor shortage that made it possible. This brings us to our final keyword: resilience. Resilience is the ability to recover quickly from difficulties. It is the toughness of the human spirit. The English peasantry was resilient. They were knocked down by the plague, knocked down by the law, and knocked down by the army. But they got back up. They kept working. They kept demanding better. As you continue your journey in English, be resilient. The grammar is hard. The pronunciation is tricky. The history is complex. But like the yeomen of old, if you persist, you will master it. You will own the language, just as they eventually owned the land. Thank you for walking this gritty path with me. This has been the London Gritty Chronicles. We tell the stories that others forget. We dig up the roots. Class dismissed.